A new dawn winter descended in earnest upon the Remington estate, blanketing the grounds with snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the pale sun. The bare trees stood solemnly against the cold sky, their branches stretching upward like hands in prayer, while the lake froze over in delicate sheets of glass. Inside the mansion, fires blazed warmly in every hearth, chasing away the chill. Yet warmth from flame alone could not thaw the remnants of grief and pride that still lingered within its master's heart. Walter Remington, the man known for unshakable authority, now found himself caught between the walls he had built and the fragile light struggling to break through. The turning point came not with a grand event, but with the quiet persistence of a child's love. Ellie, whose spirit had once been buried beneath silence, was now determined to be heard. Each day she grew bolder, pulling her father into her world bit by bit. She asked him to join her when she painted, to taste the dumplings Maya had taught her to fold, to read aloud from the Mandarin storybooks her mother had once treasured. At first Walter resisted, giving half-hearted attention before retreating to his office. But Ellie's insistence was relentless, not loud or demanding but steady like water wearing down stone. She refused to let him remain a ghost in her life. One evening, as snow fell thickly outside, Ellie asked both Maya and Walter to join her in the drawing room. She had prepared something, a performance of sorts. With her small voice trembling yet resolute, she sang one of the Mandarin lullabies her mother had taught her. At first, Walter stood stiff, hands clasped behind his back, but as the melody filled the room, something inside him stirred. The sound was not merely a child's song. It was an echo of his wife's voice, a memory wrapped in innocence. His eyes burned as he watched Ellie glance between him and Maya, her message clear. She wanted them both to stand with her, to share the weight of love and loss together. When the final note faded, silence hung heavy in the room. Ellie looked up at him expectantly, her eyes shining with hope. For a long moment Walter struggled. His pride urged him to withhold, to retreat, but his heart, wounded yet yearning, pushed him forward. Slowly, awkwardly, he knelt beside his daughter, placing a hand on her small shoulder. "That was beautiful, Ellie," he said, his voice thick. Then almost in a whisper he added, "Your mother would be proud." The words unlocked something. Ellie's face lit with joy and she flung her arms around him, her small frame trembling with relief. Maya, watching quietly from the corner, felt tears sting her eyes. She knew what it had cost Walter to say those words. It was not simply praise. It was the first step toward acknowledging that grief did not need to be buried in silence. In the days that followed, Walter began to change. He still worked long hours, but he made time for Ellie in ways he never had before. He listened when she spoke, asked questions about her drawings, and allowed her to chatter in Mandarin without rebuke. Though awkward at first, he even joined Maya in encouraging Ellie's traditions, attending with a stiff dignity the small Lunar New Year celebration Maya organized in the kitchen, complete with paper lanterns and sweet dumplings. The staff, long accustomed to his distance, watched in astonishment as their employer softened before their eyes. Maya, though grateful for the change, found herself at a crossroads. She knew she had become more than a maid in this household. She was a confidant, a teacher, a bridge between father and daughter. Yet she also knew the risks of remaining too deeply entwined. Rumors among the staff grew louder, some admiring her influence, others resentful. She worried too about her own heart. She had come to care for Ellie deeply, and despite her best intentions, she felt a quiet respect for Walter that unsettled her. He was still a man of pride, but she had glimpsed the brokenness beneath his stern facade, and compassion tethered her more firmly than she had expected. Walter noticed her unease one evening when he found her lingering by the window after Ellie had gone to bed. Snow fell softly outside, muffling the world in silence. "You're thinking of leaving," he said, his voice low but certain. Maya turned, startled. I don't want to overstay my welcome." His gaze held hers steadily. "You've never overstayed. If anything, you've given us more than I ever thought possible." He paused, his jaw tightening as though the next words cost him pride. "I owe you an apology, Maya, for what happened by the pond. For every harsh word I've thrown at you. I was wrong." The sincerity in his tone silenced her. For a moment she could only nod, the memory of that day flashing in her mind. Then she spoke softly. "It wasn't me who needed the apology, Mr. Remington. It was Ellie. She needed your voice, your presence. I only filled the silence until you could find it again. His eyes dropped, the weight of truth pressing down. But when he lifted them again, there was something different, less guarded, more human. And now I intend to keep it for her, for myself. That winter became a season of renewal for the Remington household. The walls no longer echoed only with silence but with the laughter of a child, the murmur of shared stories and the tentative beginnings of healing. Walter and Maya learned to work in unspoken harmony, their conversations no longer sharpened by hostility, but softened by mutual respect. Ellie flourished, her joy undeniable, her confidence blooming in every corner of the house. On the first day of spring, when the snow melted and the gardens began to bloom once more, the three of them walked together across the lawn. The pond shimmered in the sunlight, no longer a place of trauma but of new beginnings. Ellie ran ahead, chasing butterflies, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Walter and Maya stood side by side watching her. He turned to her quietly, almost reverently. "You were right all along, Maya. She didn't need wealth or walls. She needed love. And so did I." Maya smiled faintly, her gaze following Ellie. "Sometimes love whispers in a language we've forgotten, and all it takes is the courage to listen." The mansion, once haunted by silence, now carried the sound of life again. The walls, though scarred by grief, stood as witnesses not only to loss but to the power of healing. For Walter, Maya, and Ellie, it was not the end of their story but the beginning of a new one written not in shadows of what was lost, but in the light of what had been found again. Storms within. The first hints of winter came with an unforgiving chill that swept through the sprawling Remington estate, carrying with it a kind of solemnity that seemed to mirror the inner lives of those who lived within its walls. The once vivid autumn colors dulled into brittle browns, and the trees shed their leaves, leaving bare branches that clawed at the gray sky. Inside, fireplaces glowed with steady flames, but their warmth could not fully chase away the currents of tension that wove through the halls. Though progress had been made in recent weeks, Ellie's laughter returning, Walter daring at last to whisper fragments of his wife's songs, the deeper struggle was far from over. Walter's change was not linear. For every step he took toward vulnerability, there came another when pride and fear pulled him backward. He began spending long hours at the office again, as though burying himself in work might allow him to ignore the discomfort of facing emotions he had locked away for years. His board of directors demanded much from him, but it was not business pressure that kept him pacing late into the night. It was the memory of his daughter's small hand pulling him to sing, and the knowledge that his walls, carefully built to keep pain out, had also kept love at bay. He could not deny that Maya had been right, yet the truth gnawed at him. He resented needing her. He resented the way his daughter looked at her with unshakable devotion. Most of all, he resented that she had succeeded where he had failed. Maya felt the weight of his inner storms even without his words. She noticed how his eyes would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking, how his jaw tightened when Ellie chose her company over his, how he struggled between gratitude and hostility every time Ellie blossomed in her care. The staff began to whisper more openly now, some praising her for the change she had brought, others muttering about boundaries crossed, about how dangerous it was for a maid to insert herself so deeply into the family's affairs. A few, loyal to Walter's long-established authority, even approached her in subtle but sharp tones, warning her to remember her place. Maya bore it quietly, never lashing back because she knew her purpose was not to gain favor or prove herself. It was Ellie. The child's well-being was worth every whispered judgment. Ellie, however, was no longer the silent shadow she had been. She was growing in strength, her confidence shining through in ways that startled even those closest to her. She spoke openly in both English and Mandarin, no longer hiding the language of her heart. She challenged her tutors with curiosity, asked questions about her mother's homeland, and insisted on celebrating traditions that had long been ignored since her mother's passing. One evening, she asked Maya to help her fold paper lanterns, and together they filled her room with their glow. When Walter entered and saw the soft light dancing across his daughter's delighted face, something inside him softened despite himself. Yet the sight of Maya's hands guiding Ellie's stirred that old ache of displacement, a reminder that he had walled himself off for so long that someone else had stepped into the space he had abandoned. The breaking point came one stormy night when the wind rattled the windows and rain lashed against the panes. Walter returned late from the office, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion, only to find Ellie waiting for him in the grand hall, her rabbit clutched in one hand and determination blazing in her eyes. She confronted him with the fearless honesty only a child could wield. "Baba," she said firmly, "why do you always leave? Why don't you listen when I sing? Why do you make me feel like Mama is gone forever when I can still feel her here?" The questions pierced him more deeply than any accusation from a rival ever had. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His chest tightened, his defenses crumbling under the weight of his daughter's pain. Maya, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, not to scold or interfere, but to offer Ellie the comfort Walter could not. She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said gently, "Your father loves you more than you can imagine, Ellie. Sometimes love gets buried under fear. Sometimes adults forget that showing love is not weakness." Walter's eyes snapped to Maya, anger and shame flashing in equal measure. Yet even as the instinct to lash out rose in him, he saw the truth in her words reflected in his daughter's tear-streaked face. His anger drained into silence. He turned away, his figure rigid, and retreated into his study, leaving Maya to hold Ellie as the storm outside echoed the storm within. That night, Walter did not touch the paperwork on his desk. Instead, he poured a drink he never sipped and sat in the dark, staring at the photograph of his wife. He heard her voice in his mind, calm and wise, reminding him of the promises they had once made together. That Ellie would grow up knowing her heritage, her strength, her worth. He realized with painful clarity that he had broken that promise in the name of control. He had been so determined to erase his own grief that he had almost erased his daughter's joy. The truth weighed on him like a stone. For the first time, Walter allowed the tears he had fought for years to fall silently, the storm outside matching the storm within. Meanwhile, Maya sat at Ellie's bedside until the girl finally drifted into sleep, her small fingers still gripping Maya's hand. As she watched Ellie's peaceful face, Maya whispered a silent prayer, not for herself but for the child and the father, who so desperately needed to find their way back to each other. She wondered how long she could remain in this house, balancing on the fine line between servant and savior, between being welcomed and being resented. Yet as Ellie sighed softly in her sleep and pulled the rabbit closer, Maya knew she could not walk away. She had been placed here for a reason, and though the storms raged, she would stay until her purpose was fulfilled. By dawn, the storm outside had passed, leaving the grounds washed clean and glistening in the pale morning light. Inside the mansion, however, the storms of the heart had only just begun to clear, and the path ahead was uncertain. Yet within that uncertainty lay the fragile possibility of healing, waiting for the courage of a father to meet the steadfast love of a maid, and the unyielding hope of a child who refused to let her family remain broken. The weight of memory autumn crept slowly across the Remington estate, painting the oaks and maples in hues of amber, russet, and gold. The grounds, usually pristine in their evergreen uniformity, now carried the soft rustle of fallen leaves, a reminder that even the strongest branches could not hold on forever. Within the mansion, life seemed calmer than it had been in months. Ellie's voice rang through the halls more often now, not just as whispers but in songs, questions, and even giggles that sometimes startled the staff into stopping mid-task, as though the sound were a miracle too fragile to disturb. Yet beneath this newfound warmth, currents of memory and regret moved silently, tugging at each heart in different ways. Walter, though outwardly composed, found himself caught in the undertow of his own history. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the glow of the fireplace threw long shadows across his study, he would take out the small wooden box he kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were mementos of his wife, letters written in her delicate hand, photographs of her holding a laughing Ellie, even a small jade pendant she used to wear that caught the light in soft shades of green. He would hold these items in his hands, feeling the sharp ache of absence pressing against the armor of his pride. Lilling had been the gentle force in his life, the one who had balanced his unyielding drive with patience and wisdom. When she died, he told himself he could not afford the luxury of grief, that he must build walls strong enough for both himself and Ellie. Yet as he sat in the quiet of his study, listening faintly to the echo of Maya's lullabies through the corridors, he began to wonder if his walls had protected anything at all, or if they had only imprisoned them both. Maya, too, wrestled with the shadows of her past. Though she had returned to the mansion for Ellie's sake, she often questioned her place there. In the stillness of her small servants' quarters, She thought of her grandmother's voice, urging her always to live with integrity and courage, to see people not for what they showed the world, but for what they carried in their hearts. She remembered her years teaching children abroad, the joy of unlocking their voices through language, the pride of watching them bloom. She had lost that path after her grandmother's passing, wandering into domestic work more by necessity than by design, but something about Ellie reignited the flame she thought she had lost. Still, the risk weighed heavily on her. Walter was not a man easily softened, and one misstep could end not only her position but also the fragile trust Ellie had begun to rebuild. Each day was a balance between courage and caution, between speaking truth and knowing when silence was wiser. Ellie, in her innocent wisdom, seemed to sense the storms moving beneath the surface of the adults around her. She began to act as though she were the bridge between them, drawing her father and Maya into the same spaces with deliberate intent. At breakfast, she would insist that Maya sit beside her, then pull Walter into conversation by asking questions that only he could answer, about the stars, about the tall buildings his company owned, about the stories behind the paintings on their walls. In the evenings, she demanded they both listen to her new songs or watch her draw. More than once, Maya found herself standing at Walter's side, both of them watching Ellie spin clumsy pirouettes in the hall, her laughter filling the air. Their eyes would meet briefly, and though Walter quickly looked away, Maya saw the unspoken acknowledgement. For Ellie's sake, they were both needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the gardens in golden light, Ellie asked her father to join her and Maya by the pond. It was the same pond where so much had begun, the same place where Walter's rage had once shoved Maya into icy water. The memory made him stiffen as they approached, but Ellie's small hand tugged insistently at his own, her eyes shining with determination. They sat together on the stone edge, Maya on one side of Ellie and Walter on the other, watching Koi ripple beneath the surface. Ellie began humming softly, the melody unmistakably one of the Mandarin lullabies. Walter stiffened again, but before he could stop her, Ellie looked up at him and said gently, "Baba, listen. It makes me feel close to Mama." The words cut through him like a knife. He had avoided that truth for so long, convincing himself that banning the language and the songs would erase the pain. Yet here was his daughter, telling him plainly that the very thing he feared most was the key to her healing. For a long moment, Walter could not speak. His throat tightened, and his gaze dropped to the water where the fish swirled in silent patterns. Maya, sensing the weight of the moment, placed a hand lightly on Ellie's back but said nothing, allowing father and daughter the space they needed. Finally, Walter's voice broke the silence, low and unsteady. "Your mother, she used to sing that to you every night. I used to stand at the door and listen." His words were rough, as though dragged out from a place long sealed. Ellie's eyes widened, her hand tightening around his. "Then sing with me, Baba," she whispered. It was not a plea, but a quiet invitation. Walter hesitated, his lips parting, his breath catching. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed the melody to rise in his chest, tentative and broken, but real. He sang only a few lines, his Mandarin halting, but Ellie's face lit up with a joy so pure it nearly undid him. Maya blinked back tears as she watched, knowing she had just witnessed the cracking open of a heart that had been locked away for too long. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep with a smile still lingering on her lips, Maya lingered in the hallway outside her room. Walter emerged from within, his face lined with exhaustion but softer somehow. He paused when he saw Maya, as though weighing whether to speak. At last his voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "You were right. She needed that. I didn't want to face it, but you were right." Maya nodded, her expression calm but kind. "She doesn't need perfection, Mr. Remington. She just needs you, your presence, your voice, your love." "That's enough." For once, Walter did not argue. He only nodded, his eyes lowering briefly before he walked away down the hall. Maya watched him go, a quiet hope flickering within her that perhaps, just perhaps, the walls around his heart were beginning to fall. The mansion, though still burdened with its shadows, seemed lighter that night. The staff sensed it in the air, in the way Ellie's laughter lingered longer, in the way Walter's steps seemed less harsh on the marble floors. Change was slow, but it was coming, carried on the wings of memory, courage, and the unwavering bond between a child and those who loved her enough to listen. Cracks in the walls. The mansion, though filled once more with Ellie's laughter, still carried an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. The walls, gilded with portraits of ancestors and polished until they gleamed, seemed to watch silently as a subtle battle unfolded beneath their chandeliers. It was a battle not of fists or shouts, but of willpower, of quiet defiance and unspoken grief, of a child who clung to her memories, a maid who whispered hope, and a father who fought to maintain control of a world he believed was slipping from his grasp. Walter observed the changes in his daughter with an unease that bordered on resentment. Every evening, when he returned from meetings or long hours in his office, he found Ellie curled beside Maya, listening with rapt attention as she was told stories. Stories not from the pages of glossy books, but from Maya's own life. Tales of her grandmother's wisdom, of children she had once taught, of villages where people sang even when they had little to eat. Ellie drank in every word as though they were treasure, her eyes glowing, her heart opening. To Walter, these moments were both a balm and a blade. Balm because his daughter was alive again. Blade because it was not him who had revived her spirit. He tried to bridge the gap. At dinner one evening, he leaned toward Ellie and asked about her painting, the one she had proudly displayed on her bedroom wall. She responded politely, but her eyes drifted back to Maya, seeking her approval rather than her father's. Walter's jaw tightened. Later that night, he confronted Maya in the kitchen, his voice low but sharp. "You're overstepping. She listens to you more than she listens to me. You are confusing her loyalties." Maya did not flinch. She set down the tray she had been carrying and met his eyes steadily. "With respect, sir, children don't think in terms of loyalties. They think in terms of love. She listens to me because she feels safe. That doesn't take anything away from you, it only shows what she needs." Her words struck a nerve, though Walter masked it with a scoff. "Safe? She has everything a child could need. Tutors, security, the best medical care. What more could possibly matter?" "Presence," Maya replied softly. "Understanding. A voice that tells her it's all right to miss her mother, and that missing her doesn't mean she's broken." For a moment, silence filled the kitchen, so heavy it seemed to press down on them both. Walter's face hardened. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, but as he walked away, her words clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. Ellie, meanwhile, was discovering her own courage. For so long she had been silent, lost in grief. But Maya's return had awakened something fierce and determined inside her. She began to speak more openly at the table, sometimes correcting her father in Mandarin when he misunderstood her words. The first time it happened, Walter froze, the fork halfway to his mouth as Ellie calmly repeated herself with childlike patience. The staff held their breath, expecting him to lash out. Instead, he lowered his fork slowly, his expression unreadable, and allowed the correction to stand. It was a small victory, but Ellie noticed, and she smiled to herself that night before drifting to sleep. The household staff could not help but whisper. They had served the Remingtons for years, had witnessed Walter's rise to power and the deep silence that followed his wife's death. Never before had they seen him challenged in his own home, not by business rivals, not by board members, and certainly not by a maid. Yet here was Maya, unafraid to speak truths he did not want to hear, and somehow, instead of dismissing her outright, he allowed her to remain. The cooks speculated in hushed tones. The butlers traded glances. The maids shook their heads in disbelief. Something was changing in the mansion, though no one could yet name what it was. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled over the hills and rain streaked down the tall windows, Walter found himself lingering outside Ellie's room. He had intended to pass by, but the sound of Maya's voice held him there, rooted to the spot. She was telling a story in Mandarin, her voice low and soothing, and Ellie's gentle laughter floated out into the hall. For the first time in months, Walter felt a pang of longing. Not for control, not for order, but for the warmth of what had been lost. He leaned against the wall unseen and closed his eyes, the memory of his wife's voice rising unbidden in his mind. The ache was sharp, but within it lay a whisper of something he had nearly forgotten. Hope. But hope is fragile, and pride is heavy. The next morning, Walter summoned Maya to his office. He sat behind his imposing desk, papers stacked in precise piles, his expression cool. "You're doing good work with Ellie," he said at last. His tone clipped as though the words cost him more than he cared to admit. "But don't mistake this for permission to meddle in things that don't concern you. I run this household. I decide what's best for my daughter." Maya clasped her hands together, forcing herself to remain calm. "Of course, sir. But if I may say, What's best for her isn't something money can decide. It's something she feels. She feels connected when she speaks her mother's language. She feels alive when she's understood. That's not meddling. That's giving her back her childhood. Walter's eyes flashed, but instead of lashing out, he looked away, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. He could not deny the truth of her words, though he hated that they came from her lips. After a long pause, he dismissed her curtly, yet the conversation echoed in his mind long after she left the room. Ellie, oblivious to the quiet war between her father and Maya, continued to flourish. Her laughter grew bolder, her words more confident. She began to draw pictures not only of her mother but of her father and Maya together, holding her hands as they stood beneath the sun. When Walter discovered one of these drawings tucked beneath her pillow, his breath caught. For a long moment he stared at the crayon figures, the childish scrawl of his daughter's hope. Then with a sigh he folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, unable to throw it away. The walls of the mansion were beginning to crack, not from neglect, but from the pressure of change. Grief, pride, love, and hope all pressed against each other, reshaping the household in ways none of them had anticipated. And in those cracks, light began to seep through, illuminating paths none of them had dared to walk before. The return, when the black sedan rolled quietly through the iron gates of the Remington estate, Maya sat stiff-backed in the leather seat, her palms pressed together tightly on her lap. She had not expected to see the mansion again so soon, and certainly not under these circumstances. The car glided up the circular driveway, past fountains that sprayed crystalline arcs into the morning air, and gardens trimmed with the precision of a sculptor's chisel. Yet despite all the grandeur, her stomach knotted with unease. To anyone else, this estate might have been a dream of wealth realized, but to Maya it now carried the weight of memory, both the tenderness of Ellie's small whisper and the sting of Walter's furious shove. She wondered why she had agreed to come back. Was it duty, compassion, or perhaps something deeper? An unexplainable pull that told her the story between her, the child, and the grieving father was not yet finished? The car stopped before the front steps, and the chauffeur opened the door with practiced formality. Maya stepped out, her shoes clicking softly on the stone, and drew her coat tighter against the cool morning breeze. The heavy doors of the mansion opened before she could even knock, revealing the familiar interior. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, sweeping staircases that curved upward like twin arms, and chandeliers casting warm light that could not erase the underlying chill. The headmaid greeted her stiffly, her eyes betraying both surprise and relief. She did not speak much, only gestured for Maya to follow. As Maya's footsteps echoed through the hall, she could not shake the sensation that the house itself was watching her return. And then, at the end of the corridor, a sudden sound broke the silence. Rapid, hurried footsteps, small yet desperate. Before Maya could even register what was happening, Ellie came running, her tiny slippers slapping against the marble. Her rabbit dangled from one hand, ears dragging across the floor, but she didn't care. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears that sparkled like morning dew. She flung herself into Maya's arms with such force that Maya nearly lost her balance. The child buried her face against Maya's shoulder, sobbing, "Nihuilaile! Nihuilaile!" "You came back. You came back!" Maya's heart clenched so tightly she thought it might shatter. She wrapped her arms around the trembling girl, stroking her hair, whispering softly, "Yes, little one. I'm here now." The warmth of Ellie's embrace melted away the doubts that had plagued Maya during her ride. In that instant, she knew she had made the right choice. Whatever storm awaited her in this household, she would endure it for this child who clung to her as though she were the last safe place in the world. Walter appeared moments later at the top of the staircase, his presence as commanding as ever, though his expression was unreadable. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, his gaze fixed not on Maya but on his daughter. He had expected Ellie might be glad, perhaps relieved, but he had not anticipated this flood of affection, this fierce devotion. The sight of his usually silent, withdrawn daughter clinging so tightly to a maid shook something inside him. He masked it quickly, straightening his shoulders, his tone calm but firm. "That will be enough, Ellie, let her breathe." But Ellie only shook her head, her small arms tightening around Maya's neck. She whispered stubbornly, "Boo-yow," refusing to let go. Maya felt the tension in the air grow taut like a string pulled to its breaking point. She met Walter's eyes over Ellie's head, searching for any sign of the man beneath the armor. His jaw clenched and he looked away first. The days that followed Maya's return were filled with a mixture of relief and unease. Ellie blossomed almost overnight, her laughter returning in faint, fragile bursts, her appetite reviving under Maya's gentle coaxing. The girl began to speak more, sometimes in Mandarin, sometimes in English, as though rediscovering the music of her own voice. She insisted Maya sit beside her at meals, demanded that Maya read her bedtime stories, and often followed her through the halls like a shadow. The staff whispered amongst themselves, astonished at the change. The child who had been a ghost was alive again, and it was the maid, not the father, who had performed the miracle. Walter noticed, of course. He observed quietly from the edges of rooms, his eyes narrowing with both suspicion and reluctant admiration. On one hand, he felt an almost painful gratitude that his daughter was speaking again, that she was smiling, eating, engaging with the world. On the other, a bitter knot twisted in his chest every time Ellie chose Maya over him. Every time she whispered in Mandarin words that reminded him of his wife. He told himself that Maya was dangerous, not in a physical sense, but in the way she awakened parts of his daughter that he had worked so hard to suppress, parts that reminded him of his loss. And yet, when he saw the light in Ellie's eyes, he could not bring himself to send Maya away again. For Maya, the return was not without its challenges. Walter was polite but distant, his instructions curt, his demeanor cold. There were moments when his eyes softened unexpectedly, but they vanished as quickly as they came, replaced by the steel mask of a man who refused to show weakness. Maya knew better than to push him. Instead, she focused on Ellie, pouring her energy into nurturing the girl's fragile spirit. She taught her new songs, introduced small games, and even coaxed her into painting, filling her room with bright colors that seemed to chase away the gloom. Each day, Maya whispered words of encouragement, reminding Ellie that her voice mattered, that her feelings were real, and that even in sorrow, beauty could be found. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile peace, tension simmered. Walter struggled with a growing conflict inside him, torn between his instinct to control and his dawning realization that love could not be commanded, only offered. Maya, too, wrestled with her own doubts. Was she truly helping, or was she stepping into a place she did not belong? And Ellie, caught between the memory of her mother and the sternness of her father, clung ever tighter to the woman who whispered comfort in the language of her heart. The mansion, once silent and suffocating, began to echo with new sounds. The laughter of a child, the soft strains of Mandarin lullabies, the hesitant conversations between people learning to trust one another. But shadows lingered in every corner, and though progress had been made, the deeper wounds of grief and pride remained unhealed. It was in those shadows that the next chapter of their story would unfold, testing the strength of bonds newly formed and the courage of hearts still learning how to forgive. Shadows of the mansion. The days following the Koi Pond incident passed slowly in the Remington estate, dragging their weight through the air like heavy curtains that refused to be drawn back. Although the household staff continued with their duties, polishing the marble floors, trimming the hedges, preparing the CEO's meals with precision, the atmosphere felt hollow. Something had shifted, though nobody dared speak of it in front of Walter Remington. His anger was known to be swift and his rules unbreakable. Yet even the strictest of rules cannot command the fragile soul of a grieving child. And little Ellie bore her silence like an invisible crown of thorns. Walter sat in his private office most evenings, the desk covered in reports, contracts, and stock performance graphs that once fueled his sense of invincibility. He told himself that work was his anchor, that the empire he had built could not pause for personal sorrow, but every so often his eyes drifted to the family portrait on the wall. His wife, Liling, had been the heart of their home. A woman of grace and intelligence, she had insisted that Ellie learn Mandarin from birth. She believed in the strength of heritage, in the wisdom of language carrying memory. Walter had tolerated it then, even admired his wife's dedication, but since her passing he viewed it only as a wound, a painful reminder of a love that had been taken from him far too soon. For this reason he had banned the language, silenced the songs, and forbidden anything that tethered Ellie to the ghost of her mother. He thought he was protecting them both. In truth, he was only deepening the cracks. Ellie, on the other hand, was unraveling in ways only a child could. She refused the tray of food placed in her room. She ignored her piano tutor, who attempted cheerful scales that rang flat without Ellie's participation. She sat by her window seat for hours, staring at the gardens where she had last heard Maya's voice. In her tiny hands she clutched the rabbit tighter, humming fragments of Mandarin lullabies with lips pressed so close to the toy's ear, it was as though she was whispering secrets to her absent friend. Each night when her father came to kiss her forehead, she whispered softly, "Wo yao ta," and though he didn't always understand the full grammar, he understood enough. "I want her." The words haunted him. He would leave her room, stride down the hall and pour himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly as though the whisper of his daughter could strike more powerfully than any corporate rival. He told himself she was young, that she would forget, that all she needed was time. Yet in the deepest hours of the night, when silence filled even his sternest defenses, he wondered if time was against him. Meanwhile, Maya lay in her small apartment across town, shivering beneath blankets as fever gripped her body. She had always been strong, the kind of woman who carried burdens without complaint. But the cold pond water and the emotional weight of that morning had left her fragile. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, came by with soup and checked on her daily, clucking her tongue and scolding her gently for pushing herself too hard in life. Maya smiled weakly, but inside, her thoughts returned again and again to Ellie's trembling voice, the way the child had finally spoken, the hope that had blossomed only to be ripped away. It wasn't just a matter of employment anymore. It was something deeper. She felt as though she had been placed in Ellie's life for a purpose, though she couldn't yet see how it would unfold. By the end of the week, Maya's fever began to subside. Her strength returned slowly, though her heart remained heavy. She hadn't expected Walter to apologize. Men like him rarely did, but she thought perhaps the household would send for her, or at least check if she was alive. No message came, no carriage from the estate. Silence was her only answer. Still, she couldn't shake the vision of Ellie's eyes wide with fear as her father carried her away. Back at the mansion, Ellie grew restless. On the 6th day, she refused to get dressed. When the head maid came to coax her into a fresh dress, she stamped her small foot and shouted, "Booyah!" "I don't want to." Shock rippled through the staff. It was the first time she had raised her voice since her mother's passing. The head maid reported it nervously to Walter, who dismissed it as childish misbehavior. But deep down, something twisted inside him. His daughter was slipping further from him, and he did not know how to stop it. On the 7th day, during breakfast in the grand dining hall, Ellie did the unthinkable. She pushed her plate away with a determined shove, her eyes blazing with stubborn fire. "I want Maya," she declared, not in Mandarin this time, but in English, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. For a moment, Walter simply stared, fork paused in his hand. The entire room fell still, the staff frozen in their duties as though waiting for the explosion that surely must follow. But Walter didn't explode. He simply set down his fork, folded his hands together, and studied his daughter with an expression that was equal parts confusion and vulnerability. He had faced hostile shareholders, ruthless competitors, and entire markets collapsing at once, but nothing had ever disarmed him like the sight of his daughter's tear-streaked face, demanding not toys, not lessons, not privileges, but a maid who had fallen into a pond because she had dared to care. That night, as he sat in his office nursing another untouched glass of whiskey, Walter stared at the photograph again. His wife's smile seemed to whisper to him from the gilded frame, "She needs more than your money. She needs love, connection, memory. She needs someone who speaks to her heart, not just commands her obedience." Walter rubbed his temples and groaned. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, and the feeling gnawed at him. The following morning, without announcing his intentions to anyone, Walter instructed his driver to fetch Maya from her apartment. The order shocked the staff into silence, but no one dared question him. When the black car pulled up outside Maya's modest building, she was startled to see the chauffeur standing tall and formal at her door. She hesitated, fear and pride warring inside her, but something stronger. The memory of Ellie's whispered "Wo yao ta" pulled her to her feet. She gathered her coat, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the waiting car. As the estate gate swung open once more to receive her, Maya felt both dread and determination settle in her chest. She knew this was not just a return to a job. This was the beginning of something far larger, something that would test her courage, her heart, and perhaps even her faith in forgiveness. Somewhere inside those tall, silent walls, a little girl waited for her, and perhaps in some hidden corner so did redemption. The silence of the estate. The Remington estate had always been a monument of grandeur: white stone columns, sweeping verandas, endless manicured lawns where the grass glistened like emeralds under the morning sun. To outsiders, it was the kind of home people imagined when they thought of wealth and power. But inside those tall, polished walls, silence lingered like a ghost. Walter Remington, the CEO of Remington Global Holdings, had built his empire on decisiveness, dominance, and unyielding control. But after the loss of his wife, silence became his closest companion. The house was full of staff, maids, butlers, cooks, gardeners, but laughter had vanished. And his daughter, little Ellie, had become a quiet shadow who drifted through hallways clutching her stuffed rabbit, her voice locked away. Maya Williams, the new maid, had sensed it from the first day. She had come from a background very different from most of the estate's staff. Born in a small southern town, raised by a grandmother who believed in hard work and compassion, Maya had never imagined herself working in the mansion of a billionaire. But when the agency called her for the position, she felt something inside whisper, "This is where you're needed." The morning encounter that morning, as dawn stretched across the sky, Maya carried a basket of linens across the lawn. She breathed in the crisp air, trying to steady herself against the feeling that someone was watching. And then she saw her Ellie, barefoot, her hair unbrushed, her small frame trembling, stood near the koi pond. The mist swirled around her ankles, making her look like a fragile spirit. Maya dropped the basket without hesitation. "Sweet Jesus, little one, what are you doing out here alone?" she cried, rushing forward. Ellie didn't answer. Her lips quivered, her eyes glistened. She hugged her rabbit tighter as though it were the only anchor in her world. Maya knelt, lowering herself to Ellie's level. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Are you hurt?" Her voice was calm, gentle, as though she were coaxing a frightened bird. The child stayed silent, but her eyes spoke. Loneliness, fear, and a yearning Maya understood all too well. She placed a careful hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Do you miss your mama?" Ellie blinked, and then it happened. The silence cracked. Her lips moved, and out came a whisper, soft but clear. "Whoa, ta, I miss her." Maya froze. The words were Mandarin. Perfect Mandarin. The unexpected Bondi flood of memories rushed back to Maya. Her years before becoming a maid, when she had been a language instructor overseas. She had taught English and Mandarin in classrooms filled with children who needed both education and hope. She hadn't spoken Mandarin in months, but it came back effortlessly, like a song remembered in the heart. "You speak Mandarin?" Maya whispered, astonished. Ellie nodded, her little hands tightening around her rabbit. Without thinking, Maya switched tongues. "Nishang wo gin ni chang shu gima." "Do you want me to sing to you?" Ellie's eyes lit up, just faintly, like a candle flickering in the dark. She gave the smallest nod. Maya began to sing softly, the kind of nursery tune she had once sung to her students. Her voice wove through the air, wrapping Ellie in comfort. The girl's trembling eased. She leaned against Maya, the first sign of trust she had shown to anyone in weeks. For a brief, shining moment, Maya felt something extraordinary, like she had been placed here for a reason. That her presence, her voice, her language were not accidents, but the moment shattered with the thunder of footsteps. "The CEO appears. What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice cut across the lawn like a blade. Maya stood quickly, shielding Ellie instinctively. Walter Remington, tall and commanding, strode toward them with a storm in his eyes. His dark suit seemed out of place in the morning mist. But his presence was undeniable, almost dangerous. "Sir," Maya began, but Walter's glare silenced her. "You brought her out here to manipulate her, didn't you?" he barked. Maya's heart pounded. "No, sir." She was crying. In Mandarin?" His voice trembled with rage. "That language is not to be spoken in this house. It belonged to my wife, and now she's gone." Ellie flinched at her father's voice. She tried to clutch his arm, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on Maya, burning with fury. "Please, sir," Maya said softly, keeping her voice calm for Ellie's sake. It soothes her. "You're a damn housekeeper," Walter snapped. "Not her therapist. Not her teacher. And sure as hell not her mother." His words struck like a slap, but Maya held her ground. She thought of Ellie's whisper, her tiny voice finally breaking the silence. She couldn't let fear erase that progress. "Sir," but before she could finish, Walter's anger boiled over. He stepped forward, shoving Maya with a force she hadn't expected. Her feet slipped on the wet grass. She gasped, arms flailing, before tumbling backward into the koi pond. The cold water swallowed her scream. The shattering moment Ellie shrieked. "Baba, no!" Her little voice cracked the air like lightning, desperate and terrified. But Walter didn't look back. He scooped Ellie into his arms, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard as stone. "Don't ever come near my daughter again," he snarled over his shoulder. And with that he carried Ellie away, her cries echoing into the mist. Maya surfaced, gasping, water streaming down her face. Her body shivered from the cold, but the pain in her chest wasn't from the fall. It was from the look in Ellie's eyes. A look that begged for connection, for comfort, and had been torn away. Maya pulled herself from the pond, drenched and trembling, her heart aching with more than physical chill. She whispered into the silence, "She needs love, not walls," but the estate swallowed her words whole. The days of absence, the next morning Maya didn't come in. Nor the next. Nor the one after that. Staff whispered behind closed doors. She had fallen ill, perhaps pneumonia from the cold pond water. Fever, chills. Nobody knew for certain. Walter didn't ask, but Ellie did. She sat by the window seat, her rabbit in her arms, refusing food, refusing play, refusing every attempt by tutors and nannies. She hummed the Mandarin lullabies Maya had sung, rocking herself to sleep with whispers of "Wo Yao Ta, I miss her." Each night she looked at her father with tear-filled eyes and said in Mandarin, "Wo Yao Ta." Walter's sternness cracked just a little each time, but he ignored it. Instead, he tried toys, tutors, lessons, distractions. Nothing worked because Ellie wasn't waiting for things. She was waiting for Maya. And in the quiet corners of the Remington estate, the silence began to feel heavier than ever before.